Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about the Second Great Awakening and some reform movements, and today we are talking about African Americans and the Society of the South. This will be our last lesson in Unit 4. So if you are ready, let's begin. The first thing we're going to talk about are slave rebellions and their impact. Now, there are a few famous, widely known slave rebellions. One is Denmark Vesey's slave revolt, but the one that we're going to talk about today is Nat Turner's slave rebellion because I think it's the one that College Board brings up most of the time. So, this is a slave rebellion that happens in 1831. Nat Turner is a slave. He is an educated, literate slave, sometimes working as a preacher. Okay, and he leads one of the biggest slave rebellions in US history, where 55 whites are killed. And that Turner ends up executed at the end of this slave rebellion. Now, we're not going to get into the details of the rebellion, but what College Board needs us to know is that this slave rebellion is going to scare the South, which is going to lead to slave codes becoming more strict. And that's an important concept to know. When we see slave rebellions in America, at least, right, it's going to lead to this laws about slavery becoming more strict. So, for example, they're banning the teaching of reading and writing to slaves. Okay. Now, African American communities are going to start to develop even under enslaved African Americans, okay, because they're trying to work and develop strategies to protect their dignity, to protect their family structures. Often they created surrogate families when a slave was sold, because sometimes they would break up nuclear families like mom, dad, kids. They'd break those families up by selling slaves at auction or by the death of slaves. And so they'd create these surrogate families, which are families that they're kind of creating among the people around them, okay, to try to, again, protect that dignity. Okay. They also created a lot of slave music, which would help pass the time while working. It was instrumental in religious services. And so, this is again different ways that their African Americans at the time are trying to protect their dignity and kind of create their own communities. African Americans are also going to join some political efforts to try to change their status. We talked about this last time with Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, former slaves that are working to change the status of all African Americans in the United States. And another group to know about is the American Anti Slavery Society. It's another example of a political effort that African Americans are joining to change their status. The last thing here that's important to know about is kind of the differences between the North and the South and how African Americans' situation are, right? So in the North, we know that most African Americans are free. The vast majority of them are free, but they're still facing tension, especially with Irish immigrants. Okay, so Irish immigrants and African Americans in the North are competing over low skilled jobs, and so that tension is building. Okay, in the South, there is a free black population, but a lot of African Americans in the South are slaves, and there's a lot of restrictions put on African Americans' daily life in the South, whether free or not, especially after Nat Turner's Rebellion, like we just talked about. So, as far as how the South is viewing slavery, some of this is a little bit of review, but we need to make sure we understand how the South is viewing slavery at the time. Now, most Southerners do not own slaves. It's important to know that. I think our perception of the South in the early 1800s is that most people owned slaves, but they did not. It was too expensive for most people to own slaves. Only about 25% of them did. But most Southerners did support slavery. Okay. And so there's an idea here that, you know, convincing poor white people to support slavery puts them, in their heads one step above slaves and African Americans. Okay. So at least they're better than someone, and maybe they're not so upset about their status in life. Okay. So that's kind of how one of the ways that most people are willing to support slavery in the South at the time. Okay. So a lot of Southern people are going to defend slavery, and they're going to be led by leaders and writers. And one important person to know who is a big supporter of slavery is this guy on the right, John C. Calhoun. You can see him pictured on the right. Um, he talks about slavery as a positive good. Now, this is something we talked about last time. So they're now trying to make slavery, the argument for it, that it is good for slaves. It is supported in the Bible. It's good for the slaves and the slave owners, and this is a good system to have. That's the argument that they're now using instead of it being a necessary evil. And I just want to use this as an example. This is an important term to know, gag resolutions. Okay, these are resolutions that get passed in Congress and the House of Representatives in the 1830s and 40s. And it's a great example to show how tense the slavery topic was getting, especially in the government between the North and the South. So the gag resolutions are basically rules that say you can't even bring up slavery in the House of Representatives. Okay, you can't even talk about it because it was just a non-starter. The South was not going to accept a change in their regulations no matter what about slavery. So that just shows you how tense things were getting as we get into our next unit, as we get into the Civil War. So the impact of cotton on the economy is one of the big reasons for slavery, and it's also a way that we can see how the North is complicit in slavery. Okay, so the US economy is going to increase at this time. We've talked about this before with the market revolution, right? And why is it increasing? Well, it's kind of these four main reasons. The South is making a lot more cotton. Think Eli Whitney, think the cotton gin, and they're going to sell that cotton to the North and to Europe. And in the North, in the United States, they're going to take that cotton, make it into clothes in textile factories. This should be reviewed for you. There's also a lot of growth of the banking industry in the United States in general. And banks are going to give out loans to people. And loans make it easier for people to start their own businesses and grow industry, right? Because if you don't have enough money to start a business, it's going to be really hard for economy to grow, right? But if banks can loan money out, people can willing to take more risks, it's going to help the economy grow. The last big impact of cotton on the US economy is the shipping industries. Okay, so the northern merchants are going to make a ton of money from the sale of cotton and from how they're trading the textiles around the world. Okay, and so as the North continues to focus on industrialization and the factory system, the South is going to continue to focus on staple crops and cash crops. Okay, plantation owners in the South are owners of farms, right, who own huge farms, and they're going to exercise tremendous power over the government and the life of people in the South. And it's just important to know, we've talked about this before, but this link between the North and the South economically, even if the North is full of, has a significant minority of abolitionists, the North is complicit in the South slavery because of the economic focus of the North. Okay, so the last topic to talk about is how slavery is going to expand, and this is going to be important, especially as we get into our next unit, our next topic, leading into the Civil War. So in the Deep South, okay, the land is over cultivated by a lot of plantation owners. Okay, so what that means is the land is farmed again and again and again. Okay, and the soil is depleted of the nutrients, so a lot of plantation owners start to move west of the Appalachians into what will at this time it's called the Deep South. So Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, Eastern Texas. Okay, and as these people move west, the institution of slavery is going to move with them. And we'll see this, and we've talked about this before, as new states come up, the South is going to want slavery to be allowed in these areas, and the North is going to try to restrict it. We talked about that with the Missouri Compromise, but we're going to see how that starts to fail in our next unit, and we're going to get into more compromises and more difficulties with the issue of slavery because of its expansion. Okay, so that is it for our notes on the African Americans Society and the Society of the South. Thank you so much for watching. This is our last notes for Unit 4. So let's try to synthesize all this with our big ideas, right? So what is the effect of Nat Turner's Rebellion? 2, what was the Southern view on slavery in the mid-1800s? And 3, describe the impact of cotton on the economy. Again, thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.